Great. Well, thank you, Mohammed. Greetings, everyone. My name is Paul Morris. I'm with SRF Consulting Group, located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. For those that are interested, it's snowing pretty good outside here in Minneapolis right now. So happy Halloween, I guess you might say. We're excited to share our presentation today about the case study in Minnesota. We did look at several different potential case studies here and ultimately selected the one that was along US Highway 10. This was expected to be a very interesting example for a case study because it's right at the location on the fringe of the urbanized area where Highway 10 transitions from a freeway in the urban area to a signalized expressway further to the west. You can see that where the illustrated where the blue turns into red. And I think there was interest in testing this methodology not only on freeway facilities, but also interrupted flow type facilities. So the first step in the process is the planning and scoping here. As I noted, this is kind of in the northwest portion of the metro area. And so the predominant flows are eastbound or coming into the metro in the morning, and then westbound in the afternoon. And because those signals are on the western portion of the corridor, our focus was going to be on the afternoon peak period during the commute home from work. One of the other interesting characteristics of this corridor is that it also serves as a gateway from the Twin Cities metro area to greater Minnesota, where a lot of metro area residents go on the weekends and during the summertime for recreational activities like camping, fishing, etc. And so we knew that some of the operational issues that this corridor experienced were due to that recreational travel and not just the traditional weekday peak periods here. And so we did want to make sure we were taking that into account. And the Volume 3 methodology actually works very well as a way to incorporate that into the analysis. So step 2 really gets into the data collection. We're very fortunate in this region that we're in a data-rich environment. Through the freeway portion of the corridor, there are loop detectors embedded in the pavement roughly every half mile. And so that gives us a very deep supply of data, providing estimates of speed and very detailed information on volume or flow. And we were also able to collect data in another number of other categories, including weather, travel times from the NPM RDS, and we worked with partners at the local traffic management center to get information about crashes and incidents that had occurred during the time period. And I should also note, the entire year of 2019 was the data collection time period, and we were able to obtain data for all 365 days. So the next step in the calibration or the data collection process is the clustering here. And so following the guidance in the analysis, cluster sizes from a minimum of 3 up to 27 clusters were analyzed. And this was done using a Python script. Obviously, this is a big data analysis, and so some additional analytical power was needed there. And so each of the dots represents the goodness of fit parameter, which in this case is labeled as inertia, against the number of clusters. The dashed line that passes through all those points is the fit. So you can see it does generally decrease as additional clusters are added, meaning that each day or observation is more closely related to the cluster that it is assigned to. However, what really stuck out to us is that clusters 4, 5, and 8 really were outperforming the rest. And so you can see those ones with stars on them fall below that trend line, suggesting that they sort of outperform what we would expect just based on the general reduction. And so we looked into those in more detail. And using the methodology in the guidance, which I should note, I strongly recommend printing that out. That became my best friend while we were conducting this work, and extremely helpful to refer to that, determined that the 5-cluster model provided the best trade-offs, because part of what the guidance recognizes is that you're trying to optimize not just the fit of all the observations and the clusters that they belong to, but also recognizing that additional clusters comes with additional cost in terms of the model variants that have to be developed. And so you're trying to find the balance between that goodness of fit and the number of clusters. So the next step as we move into model calibration is to identify the representative days. So while we have these clusters that represent 5 typical conditions or frequently occurring conditions throughout the year, we still need to select an individual day so that the model can be calibrated to those specific conditions. So you can see that the specific dates in 2019 that were identified as the best representation of each of those clusters is shown there. And I will say it was important to us to confirm that those days met the characteristics of the cluster. Now, while the cluster, is identified mathematically, it doesn't necessarily, have to meet those characteristics. These were the general themes that we observed. And so we wanted to make sure, for example, that on December 30th, there was actually snow. And we were able to confirm that there was. Obviously, that's right in the middle of the winter. Similarly, the other days in clusters 1 and 2, June 27th and March 4th, are both weekdays, and November 16th was a weekend. We were a little surprised that in cluster 4 was on February 15th. We probably would have guessed that that was a Friday afternoon in the summer when a lot of folks are heading to their summer cabins or camping. But it turns out that February 15th was actually the Friday before President's Day weekend. And so that also represents kind of that recreational peak when a lot of people travel away from the metro for holidays. So now that we know what those representative days are, we're able to compute the what we call the variation envelopes for each of the clusters. And so this is just one example from cluster 4, but there are similar graphics for each of the clusters. Basically, the line with the triangles in it represents the actual observations from the representative day. And then the 1 and 2 standard deviation bands are traced out above and below those lines. And so it's very important to be able to see that, because it's critical to follow the steps in the guidance and meet the calibration. On the next slide, we've overlaid the outcomes of the calibrated model onto that. And so a couple of key things that we can see, we were fortunate in this case that the simulated output fell not only within the 2 standard deviation band, but in most cases within the 1 standard deviation band. And so it's very helpful to visualize this just to see kind of where those model results are relative to those calibration envelopes. However, to actually complete the calibration process as prescribed in the guidance, it's not just a visual review of those graphs. In fact, I think that is what the 2019 update was trying to get away from in many ways, to make it really more of a statistical review. And so for those that have read the guidance, and I again encourage you to do that, there are 4 criteria that establish a properly calibrated model. And while, there are some sizable equations, let's say, in the guidance underpinning each of those 4 criteria, once we understood those and plugged them into some spreadsheets, it actually became very efficient to complete the calibration here. The other thing that I would just say that we like about this is, while some of the previous methodology, either in the previous traffic analysis tools guidance or some of the procedures used by individual state DOTs, does leave room for some subjectivity in the calibration process. We think it's extremely positive that this guidance has pretty black and white criteria, so that once those thresholds are met, and the calibration is achieved, everyone can agree that the calibration process has been satisfied and can move on to the next steps of the modeling. Okay, so the final step I want to touch on here today is the alternatives analysis. I think we're likely all familiar with this as part of the project development process. But again, sticking with the theme, the 2019 guidance brings more statistical rigor into that process. The particular project that we were analyzing, which is now under construction, was to invest in grade-separated interchanges where signals are currently located, as those were found to be primarily responsible for the congestion that was observed. However, we added a few more alternatives here just for the purposes of this demonstration. So we also explored a signal timing optimization that would not require capital investment, as well as an auxiliary lanes option that would supplement that interchange alternative. One of the other steps that is part of the alternatives analysis process in the guidance is to determine the number of iterations or runs that's required for each of the model variants and each of the alternatives. And we actually found this to be a very interesting result, but fortunately it was also intuitive that the most congested clusters, which include 1, 2, and 4, under the most congested alternatives, namely the do nothing and signal timing optimization, required the maximum number of 20 iterations. However, under the other clusters that were less congested, or the build alternatives that essentially resolved all the congestion issues, the minimum number of 4 iterations was identified. And so, again, we thought this was an interesting exercise, both to demonstrate the guidance, but also that it makes intuitive sense that highly congested facilities are highly variable. And so it requires a lot of iterations of a model in order to achieve some convergence. Whereas when it's really uncongested, the model results tend to be very consistent from one iteration to another. And so last thing I'll touch on here is just the results of our alternatives analysis. As Mohammed described just a few minutes ago, this does bring in a statistical hypothesis testing methodology. And so while that might sound, a little intimidating for us as engineers or planners rather than scientists here, I can assure you, it's very logical, and the math really is nothing to be afraid of. But again, the other thing that it does do is I think it puts the results of the models into context of whether they're meaningful and whether they, are significant at a statistical level here. And so just to highlight a few of the examples here, looking across a couple of different alternatives, that when we compared the do nothing and the signal optimization alternatives, while there were some benefits in terms of travel time, it was not found to be statistically significant. And so we're rejecting that hypothesis here. Whereas with the interchanges, that was highly significant compared to the do nothing or signal timing alternatives. And so I think this is something we all intuitively know looking at the model results, but now we have some statistical rigor to back that up, and I think can use that as even stronger evidence as we're working with local partners or regulators to all have a shared understanding of the differences amongst the alternatives. So thank you for the opportunity to share our case study here today. I'll turn it over to Barack now to talk about Colorado.